I want to tell you about a guy I know, smart guy, genuinely one of the sharpest people in any room he walks into. The kind of person who's read widely, thought deeply, and has an interesting take on almost everything. You'd enjoy having a drink with him for the first 20 minutes. After that, something shifts. You start to notice that every story you tell reminds him of his own story. Every opinion you offer becomes a launching pad for his opinion. Every time you're halfway through a sentence, he's already nodding, not because he's listening, but because he's already decided what you mean and he's composing his response. And by the time you leave the conversation, you realize something. He never asked you a single question, not one. You know his views on 6 different topics. He couldn't tell you what city you grew up in. The strange part? He walks away thinking it went great. He was charming. He was engaged. He had good things to say. He doesn't realize that you left feeling invisible. Now here's the uncomfortable part of this story. That guy is not a villain. He's not cold or cruel or deliberately self-centered. He's just following the default setting. The one almost all of us run on, most of the time without ever questioning it, because talking, filling space, sharing our experiences, offering our perspectives, feels like connection. It mimics the form of it. It produces the sensations associated with it. But it is not the same thing. And deep down, on the receiving end of it, we all know the difference. This video is about that difference. And more than that, it's about what's waiting on the other side of it, for the person willing to do the harder, rarer, more rewarding thing. Why we're wired to talk. Let me start with the science, because I think it explains everything. Harvard University put people in brain scanners and watched what happened when they talked about themselves versus when they talked about other things. And what they found was stark. Talking about your own experiences, your own opinions, your own life, it activates the same reward pathways in the brain as food and money. Think about that. Your brain treats self-disclosure as a resource, a literal reward. Every time you open your mouth to share your perspective, your story, your reaction, you get a neurological pat on the back. A quiet hit of dopamine that says, good, keep going. And if that's happening inside your head, what do you think is happening inside everyone else's? The same thing. Exactly the same thing. Which means every conversation you enter is, on a neurological level, 2 people competing for the same reward. 2 brains, both incentivized to speak, both pulling toward the front of the conversation, both getting rewarded for it when they succeed. That's the baseline. That's where every conversation starts. And when you understand that, the number I'm about to give you stops being shocking and starts making complete sense. Research published in Scientific American found that the average person spends around 60% of their conversations talking about themselves. 60. And when you move the conversation to social media, that number climbs to 80%. Sit with that for a second. In the average conversation, the majority of what comes out of your mouth is about you, your experiences, your opinions, your take, your story. Now ask yourself honestly, in a conversation where you're talking 60% of the time, how much are you actually learning? The answer is close to nothing, because you already know everything you're saying. Every word that comes out of your mouth is a word that was already inside your head. You haven't added anything. You've just externalized something you already had, the only information that can actually change what you know. The only data that can shift your perspective or reveal something you hadn't considered is the data sitting inside the person across from you. And the only way to access it is to be quiet long enough for them to give it to you. That's the trade-off. And most people make the wrong call on it, thousands of times, every single day. The story about the negotiation. I want to tell you a story, a real dynamic that plays out in boardrooms, across dinner tables, and in every difficult conversation where something important is at stake. Picture 2 people sitting across from each other. A negotiation. Could be a business deal. Could be a salary discussion. Could be 2 people trying to work out something that matters to both of them. Person A comes in prepared. They know their position. They know what they want. And the moment the conversation starts, they lay it out. Clearly, confidently, persuasively, they've rehearsed this. They make their case, they defend their points, and they push. They're articulate and sharp, and they feel, by the time they're done speaking, like they've done well. Person B does something different. They come in with a question, and then they listen. Not politely, not half present, Not waiting for person A to finish so they can respond. Actually listen. They follow threads. They notice what person A is emphasizing and what they're glossing over. They pick up on where the energy shifts, what's being said with certainty, and what's being said with slightly less conviction. By the time person B speaks, they know things person A never intended to give away. They know the priorities. They know the pressure points. They know where there's flexibility and where there isn't. They've been handed a roadmap by someone who didn't realize they were drawing. 1. Research from some of the world's leading negotiation experts makes this point plainly. In most negotiations, the person who listens best learns the most, and therefore negotiates from a stronger position. The person who talks most is broadcasting their hand. The person who listens is collecting intelligence while giving almost none of their own away. Person A gave a great speech. Person B won the negotiation. That dynamic doesn't only live in formal negotiations. It lives in every conversation where something is at stake. The job interview where one candidate asks sharp questions and actually absorbs the answers, walking out knowing more about the role than anyone else who interviewed. The argument between two people, where the one who stops defending their position long enough to demonstrate that they genuinely understand the other person's, suddenly finds the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. When people feel truly heard, something changes in them. The defense is lower. The grip loosens. Because most of the time, what people most desperately want in a disagreement isn't to win. It's to be understood. And the person willing to provide that, willing to listen first, fully, and without agenda, holds an almost unfair amount of power. What Charles Derber noticed. In 1979, a sociologist named Charles Derber published a book called The Pursuit of Attention. He'd spent years observing conversations, really observing them, studying the patterns underneath, the surface, and what he found was so consistent and so universal that he gave it a name. He called it conversational narcissism. Now, before you assume this is about those people, the obviously self-obsessed ones, the ones you can spot from across the room, Derber was careful to point out that this wasn't primarily about them. It was about all of us. It was, he argued, the default mode of ordinary social interaction. The subtle, mostly unconscious tendency to steer conversations back toward ourselves. Not from cruelty, not from arrogance, just from habit, from instinct, from the reward system we talked about earlier that keeps nudging us back toward our own story. He identified 2 types of responses that people give in conversation. He called them the shift response and the support response. And once you learn to see them, you cannot unsee them. Here's how they work. Someone says to you, "I've been having a really tough time at work lately." The shift response sounds like this. "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. My last 6 months have been absolutely brutal. Let me tell you what happened with my manager. You see what just happened?" The conversation moved. The person who was speaking is now listening. The person who was listening is now speaking. And the original speaker, the one who was trying to share something difficult, is now sitting there, nodding, while the moment they were building toward disappears. The shift response isn't rude. It doesn't sound rude. It often sounds like empathy. "I know exactly what you mean" is a warm thing to say. But it's a redirect. The spotlight moved. The support response sounds like this. "That sounds hard. What's been going on?" 4 words, or 2. Or just, "Tell me more." The focus stays. The door stays open. And what comes through that open door is usually the thing the person actually wanted to say. The real version, the one underneath the opener, the one they were testing the water with before deciding whether it was safe to go deeper. Derber found that most people, in most conversations, default almost entirely to the shift response. They match stories. They escalate each other's problems. They respond to emotions with their own emotions. It creates a kind of conversational ping-pong that feels like connection and produces very little of it. Think about the last time someone really listened to you. Not just waited for their turn, actually listened. Asked a follow-up question that proved they'd tracked what you said. Stayed with you in the thing you were talking about instead of pivoting away? How often does that happen? And how did it feel when it did? I'll tell you how it feels. It feels rare. It feels almost disarming because you weren't expecting it. You came in ready to have a normal conversation, the kind where you share, they share, you share again, Nobody is really tracking, and instead someone just stayed with you, and you probably talked more than you intended to. You went deeper than you planned. You said things you hadn't fully articulated before, because the quality of the listening created the conditions for the thinking to happen in real time. That's not an accident. Research from the Royal Society found that high-quality listening doesn't just benefit the person doing the listening, it improves the quality of thinking in the person being listened to. When someone is genuinely heard, they become more reflective, more nuanced, more able to access parts of their own experience that surface pressure and distraction usually bury. Which means a great listener doesn't just receive better information. They help create it. They pull something out of you that wouldn't have existed without them, and the effect on the listener is equally real. Studies show that people who consistently practice genuine listening retain up to 75% more information from conversations. That's not a small edge. That's the difference between walking out of a meeting with 3 things and walking out with 12. Same conversation, same room, completely different yield. There's also something that happens in the brain during really good listening that's worth knowing about. Neuroscientists have observed a phenomenon they call neural coupling, where the brain patterns of a genuine listener begin to synchronize with those of the person speaking. Your brain, in a very literal sense, starts to mirror theirs, which means the better you listen, the better you understand not just the words, but the emotional state, the unspoken context, the thing underneath the thing. Most people have experienced this from one side without knowing it. You've met someone and walked away thinking, they just get it. They understood what you meant before you fully said it. They tracked the feeling beneath the words. You felt somehow more understood than the content of the conversation could entirely account for. That wasn't magic. That was a skilled listener operating at a level most people never reach, because most people never try. Silence is not failure. Here's the part of the argument that tends to make people the most uncomfortable. Silence is not your enemy. Most of us have been conditioned to treat silence in a conversation as a malfunction, a gap that needs to be filled immediately by whoever can get there first. We find it genuinely uncomfortable. The pause in the conversation feels like falling, and talking feels like catching ourselves, so we fill it. We say the thing we hadn't finished thinking. We share the opinion we hadn't fully formed. We add something, not because it needs to be added, but because the silence needed to end. And here's what that costs. When you fill a silence prematurely, you take the floor back. The other person, who may have been about to say the most interesting or important thing in the entire conversation, doesn't get to say it. You interrupted the process, not loudly, not rudely, just by being slightly more uncomfortable with the pause than they were. Researchers studying negotiation dynamics found something striking when they introduced deliberate pauses into conversations. When people genuinely waited after the other side finished speaking, not fidgeting, not half-forming a response, but actually waiting, what followed changed. The quality of what was said next improved. The depth increased. The things people were holding back, testing the temperature on, deciding whether to share, they shared them. Because silence, it turns out, isn't a vacuum that makes people uncomfortable. It's an invitation. It says, I'm not rushing you. There's space here. If there's more you want to say, I'm still here for it. And people take that invitation when they feel it. Think about the conversations in your life that went somewhere unexpected, where you said something you didn't plan to say, or heard something you couldn't have anticipated. Almost certainly, there was a pause somewhere in there. A moment where the normal conversational rhythm stopped, and something else came through. That something else is what you're leaving on the table every time you rush to fill the quiet. What it actually costs to not listen. I want to come back to the man from the beginning of this video, the smart, charming, talkative one, because I want to be clear about what his habit is actually costing him. In concrete terms, not abstract ones. Every conversation he dominates. He walks away from knowing exactly what he walked in with. His model of the world updates slowly, because the only information he consistently absorbs is the information he already had before he opened his mouth. People around him know this, even if they can't name it. They learn, gradually, not to share their best thinking with him, because it'll be redirected before it lands. His relationships stay at a certain depth and stop. Not because people don't like him, but because real depth requires the experience of being known. and you cannot know someone you're not listening to. In professional settings, he misses signals that more attentive people catch. He's slower to notice when a room has shifted, when someone is uncertain, when the thing being said isn't the thing being meant. He makes more confident decisions with less complete information than the people around him who ask more and talk less. And somewhere, quietly, the people who matter to him feel a little lonely in his company. Not dramatically, not enough to name most of the time, just a low-grade sense that no matter how much time they spend with him, they aren't quite reaching him. That's the real cost. Not one dramatic failure, just a long, slow accumulation of slightly shallower relationships, slightly worse decisions, slightly less complete information, all of it traceable back to a habit that felt like engagement and functioned like a wall. Now flip it. The person who listens well, genuinely, consistently as a practice, builds something different. They become the person people want to talk to, not because of how much they share, but because of how fully they receive. They accumulate knowledge faster. They read rooms better. They navigate conflict more effectively, because they understand what's actually going on beneath the surface rather than just reacting to what's presented. And the relationships they build have a quality to them that talkative people often envy without understanding. There's a weight to them. A history of real conversations where things were actually said and actually heard. That kind of relationship is hard to build by accident. It is also very hard to destroy. Here's where I want to leave you. At some point in the next few days, you're going to be in a conversation. It might be with someone you love, someone you work with, someone you just met. And at some point in that conversation, you're going to feel the pull, the familiar, comfortable, rewarded pull to talk, to share, to respond before they've finished, to fill the silence, to make the conversation partly about you, because that's what the brain wants. I'm asking you to notice that pull. Not necessarily resist it every time, but notice it. Create the small gap between the impulse and the action where a choice can actually live. And then ask yourself 2 questions. The first, does this actually need to be said? And the second, is there a question I could ask instead? Because the question is the key. The question is how you signal that you're actually here, actually tracking, actually curious about what's inside the person across from you rather than just looking for an opportunity to share what's inside you. Ask the question, then listen to the answer. Actually listen, not with half your brain already framing the follow-up, but with the quiet, generous, rare attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what they're about to hear. You will be surprised at what people give you when you do this. You will be surprised at what they say, what they trust you with, how quickly they open up. Because most people walk through life feeling slightly underheard. Most conversations leave them with the sense that they said less than they meant to, that the other person was partly elsewhere, that what they brought to the table was received but not really held. Be the exception to that. In whatever conversation comes next, not because it makes you a better person in some vague moral sense, but because the return is real. The information you collect, the trust you build, the depth of the relationships you develop over time, the quality of decisions you make when you actually know what's going on around you. All of that is sitting on the other side of the simple, difficult, endlessly valuable act of shutting up and actually listening. Start there. Start today. Shut up and win.